Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Horowitz, and I'm co-host for the Healing Lyme Summit. And I'm very excited today to be spending time with a very good friend of mine who I've known for a long time, Dr. Sunja Schweig. Dr. Schweig is the founder and president of the California Center for Functional Medicine. And we're going to be discussing precision personalized medicine today and how it applies to Lyme. So, Sunja, thank you so much for coming here today. And why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Rich, Dr. Horowitz, it's great to see you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me as a guest. And hello, everyone out there in the audience. And thank you for being here. On the other hand, I'm sorry that you're here in a way, because it might mean that you personally or someone in your family is struggling with complex chronic illness, with Lyme disease or tick-borne diseases. And as many of us in this field, have experienced, a lot of us came to this from a personal connection. And for me, it was my wife who was diagnosed with Lyme disease. Basically, the year after I finished my residency at the UCSF Santa Rosa Family Practice Program, and she had been sick for a decade prior, and had been to many doctors and had done many tests and had been told, everything looks normal and there's nothing wrong with you. And classic story that I think many folks out there have experienced. And Dr. Horowitz, actually, the year she was diagnosed in late September, early October of 2008, and I was scheduled to go out of town to go to a different conference, and it just so happened that ILADS was in San Francisco that year. And I remember coming over there and learning from you and from Dr. Burrascano, and being, on the one hand, completely overwhelmed and terrified, really, of what I was learning. I hadn't, never been taught any of this in med school or residency. But also, on the other hand, just remember so deeply and fondly how gracious you were with your time. And my wife came over at one point, and we sat in the lobby, and you talked through what we were seeing and what you were thinking. And that was really a key connection for me, to have that time with you and to then learn from you over the years. So thank you so much for all the work you've done and continue to do.
Oh, it's my pleasure. In fact, it's interesting. I remember that very specifically when you and I met with your wife and meeting her and going through I don't always remember. The conferences blur after a while. Is she doing much better now with the personalized treatment?
She's doing great. I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. So, and again, it was a combination of everything that did it for her, all the way down to finally doing a cleanse, and so yeah, lots of different aspects of what we'll talk about today, with medications and supplements and lifestyle and full spectrum care that really again is very personalized and is very individualized. It's very N of one, right? Every person is unique in this field.
Right. Well, you probably know from my wife, even though I had been doing this for a long time, my wife also was sick with Lyme for 25 years. She's now 4 years in remission since Dapsone. But I think a lot of us who get into this field, we have personal experiences with it. So, yeah. So why don't we just jump in? Why don't you tell me a bit how you got into functional medicine, and specifically the personalized aspect of medicine, and specifically how you're doing this for the Lyme patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a very alternative upbringing. My first name is Sanja, and that was my birth name. And I was born in Northern California in the early 70s, and actually spent 6 years of my childhood living in India. And so from my, basically my very beginning, days was infused with a real eye to and understanding of the possibilities that are out there that are much broader than Western medicine. And that includes healthy diet and mindfulness and meditation and movement and yoga, and even in India, disciplines like Ayurvedic medicine and homeopathy. And so that really informed me. And I think it was by high school where I decided, I really do believe I'm going to go into medicine, and then went to college at UC Berkeley and pursued that, as well as medical anthropology and religious studies. And so I knew that I wanted to go into medicine. I love science and I love medicine, and I think it's incredible what we can do in our Western system. However, I was also very aware of the limitations and the fact that it's not really a healthcare system; it's more of a sick care system, that we're really just trying to prune back the final manifestations of disease using therapies that block or turn off or turn down or lower your blood sugar or lower your cholesterol, or try to block pain or try to turn off the immune system, right? And so really, I was very passionate from even before I went to med school and before I went to residency about what's going on behind the scenes. Like, why are these things happening? Why are these root cause conditions happening? And so it was really, anytime I had a chance to do a rotation or mentor or do a paper or a project, I always would do it within the space of integrative medicine and functional medicine, and started in functional medicine practice right after my residency. And again, that was right around the time when my wife was diagnosed with Lyme disease. And so quickly this curtain kind of pulled back, and I realized, like, whoa, this chronic infection piece is so critical, and it's so pervasive, and so many people are struggling, whether it's Lyme or Babesia or Bartonella or Ehrlichia or other co-infections or chronic gastrointestinal infections, Giardia, H. pylori, the list goes on, Cryptosporidium, or viruses. We see a lot of Epstein-Barr and Coxsackie and parvo. I mean, the list goes on. There's so many. Our bodies are this incredibly rich terrain of balance between microorganism and human, and the information is flowing back and forth, but those can become imbalanced very quickly and with devastating effects. And so really my career has really dovetailed now towards general functional medicine, frequently a lot of folks with more complex gut issues or autoimmune issues or tick-borne or mold, et cetera. I think that's what we kind of see. A lot of us see, where these people really need help. But really, again, it has to be a very personalized approach. And we do a lot of testing. So we have really like a, test, don't guess philosophy. However, the tests, as you know, and as we know, and as everyone out there knows, are extremely limited at times. And so they're really, adjunctive information, helpful information. But it's really the symptoms, and it's really what's happening to that individual person listening to this. And that carries so much weight for practices like ours. And so it's super, it's super personalized, it's super individualized. It's very much like, as our friend and colleague, Wayne Anderson said, it's like, you just got dropped in the middle of a jungle and you have no map and you have no idea how to get out. And so you just basically, you start listening and you start trying things and you start to triangulate a path forward, right? So really it involves sitting with that person in front of us, listening carefully, putting the clues together, drawing on our experience, testing, using that information, trying things, using that information, and then working in that regard to guide people out of the mess that they might be in.
Right. So do you have a structure when you do these personalized treatment plans for patients? You were talking about, obviously the GI is very important with changes in the microbiome. We're now finding with too much Prevotella, Clostridium, not enough Akkermansia, right? All of this is coming out, mast cell, leaky gut. Do you have it set up in a personalized model where you do it in systems? Like, do you think these are the GI tests I'm going to do and symptoms I'm looking at? These are the neuro, these are the cardiac. Like, how do you structure it in your mind for both the doctors and patients that are listening?
Yeah, so we do have a system, and that's evolved over a couple of decades of doing this, and it involves a few different aspects. One is that it involves, sort of sequence of testing, and then it involves a sequence of care, and it involves a sequence of who that care is delivered by, right? And so, for example, using clinicians, we work in our practice with nutritionists and health coaches and admin support, and then also technology, data visualization, wearables, trying to get a signal, but also trying to help that person. So that whole, we think of that as like a high touch mixed with the high tech. And what we're really trying to do, especially with the high touch team approach, is to find all the problems, or as many as we can, and to start working on them, but also to give that person the support that they need to make lifestyle change and to make health behavior change, which is not easy. And it's not easy for the most able person, but it becomes more difficult when we have someone who's struggling from fatigue or cognitive impairment or a whole host of downstream conditions, which you outlined so well in your MSIDS model, right? And so it really becomes this very much a hand-holding piece. But to back up and really land on your question more definitively, I would say that the gut testing is really critical. We firmly believe that the gut is the center of the universe when it comes to the immune system. And this is a passion area of mine, but I've spoken on this at ILAS and other conferences. The tick-borne infections also, directly affect the gut and can directly infect the gut, especially Lyme and Bartonella, right? And so then they can cause this downstream cascade of inflammation and intestinal permeability. They can trigger, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so those have devastating effects downstream, and they propagate a systemic milieu of inflammation, again, of intestinal permeability, of immune dysregulation, of autoimmune activation. If you have intestinal permeability, you almost definitely have blood-brain barrier permeability, and so you're getting, the cognitive issues and the fatigue, and you can't think, memory, et cetera, plus just systemic inflammation and systemic immune disruption, systemic autoimmune activation. So we do stool testing. Frequently, we test with two labs at once. And so we'll do, like usually a Genova, because it has just a bunch of helpful markers. But I do find it's actually not very good at finding the bugs. Very rarely does a pathogen show up on there. So we also very regularly test with a company called Wellness, and they are very bare bones on their report. They don't provide any of the microbiome balances. They don't provide any of the inflammatory markers or the short chain fatty acids or digestive enzymes or anything like that. But they do show the bugs, and they definitely find those more. And so we'll do those, and then we'll do a SIBO breath test, especially if symptoms warrant. We'll do hormone testing up front, adrenals and sex hormones, and then we'll do a really comprehensive blood panel, which has markers of inflammation, key nutrients, like B12 and vitamin D, and iron, ferritin, zinc, copper, etc. And thyroid hormones, and so that really gives us an excellent snapshot of sort of like the starting place. And then from there, we then start to work on protocols, and then we start to sort of customize the testing a little bit more based on symptoms, based on response, around the bugs and around, which viruses and which tick-borne, and, are there mold and mycotoxins? Are there heavy metals? And so we sort of have our phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 that we'll put people through.
So question, the factors you consider most crucial and critical. And you brought up, of course, the gut, and of course, you're correct. I mean, it's extremely important. Most of our patients at this point, we're seeing leaky gut with food sensitivities, huge amounts of mast cell, right, which drives inflammation. So as far as the way you're doing this, is there any specific personalized treatment plans that you revisit and adjust? Like, do you always start with the terrain? Like, do you always work on the gut first in some of these people, or you find, oh, the gut's fine, actually, in some of these people, and we can just dive in with antibiotics? Or do you find like you take a couple of months and you want to tweak the hormones and get the adrenals up and, get the microbiome up? Do you have a way that you approach it in that way?
Yeah, again, there's no hard and fast rule, but in those cases where we really see very little symptom burden on the gut, and testing looks fine, then yes, we will leap to the next stages more quickly. And there's also, cases where, the burden of the tick-borne illness is so acute or so severe that, we don't really have the luxury of time of kind of doing, we have to kind of get some treatments on board just to stabilize them. But we see that as well. But the other pieces that I do really think need to be nailed down, very quickly, or at least worked on very quickly, are, sleep, sleep piece. And because these are, excuse me, these are foundational building blocks, which will help all the other treatments work better, right? So we've done some research on botanical medicines, which we'll talk about, and botanical medicines, can be antimicrobial, directly killing bugs, but they can also have these much larger, interesting systemic effects around inflammation and immune balance. And so the bugs really they thrive in a milieu of immune inflammation, of confusion, of cytokine storm. And so you can work on that whole piece of it, the cytokines in the immune system and the inflammation side, with sleep, with mindfulness and neuroplasticity and brain retraining, with proper movement, with, meditation, and with breath work. And, so all these pieces, while they might sound a little woo-woo, are actually really critical parts of the recovery path, I think, for everybody. And the more that you can really dial those in upfront, again, with the support needed to make effective change, then I think that we can frequently get away with treatment antibiotic protocols or herbal protocols, which become more effective and or can be for shorter durations, and or I think we have a less risk of relapse when we try to have the dismount, right? You try to stop therapy, and then what happens, right? So all these pieces, I think, are very, very important up front.
No, I agree. When we approach it also, we do the same thing with the inflammatory component, with the MSIDS map that you discussed. I always think of it in terms of like 6 rivers of inflammation going into an ocean where the 3 Bs, Borrelia, Babesia, Bart, and then the gut, the microbiome, leaky gut, mast cell, sleep, of course, and also mold toxins, heavy metals, and whether you have the nutrients to be able to detox. When I have this conversation of inflammation with, our mutual friend Neil Nathan, he and I go back and forth about, do you treat the mold first? Do you go after this first? Like, in what order do you do it? Because it seems like, at least in California where he is, he's finding the mold pieces are driving an inflammatory response very strongly, and that without doing that, all the other factors of inflammation may, not play a role. So do you find like patients have preferences? Do you give them choices with this, or and when you do find mold and metals, how do you evaluate like which are the most important points on this personalized treatment map? Because it does get a little bit tricky sometimes figuring out, right? Because mold can cause overlaps and fatigue and brain fog, but so do all the 3 Bs. Do you have a way you kind of figure this out, or you just kind of dive in there for patients and see how it works?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point that you bring up, because both mold toxicity, mold exposure, and also mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS, both of those buckets or those conditions have a symptom picture which looks almost exactly like Lyme disease or tick-borne infections. And so there's this incredible overlap between these 3 pieces, and all of them, basically can cause almost any symptom across almost any body system. I think in my brain, with 15 to 20 years of experience doing this, you start to get a certain amount of pattern recognition. But I think it's also important, you have to like take your lens off for from time to time, and just make sure that you're not just kind of focusing on the thing that you like to do or that you're good at doing, and really make sure you're evaluating all those areas. And so a lot of times we'll be doing things simultaneously, right? But it really does depend on sort of what the story is. For example, if somebody tells us that they were in their usual state of health, or maybe they were a little bit sick, but then they lived in a home where they had significant exposure to water damage or leaking, or known mold, et cetera, and they have testing that shows urine mycotoxins are elevated, then that will rise up. That will become, okay, we might need to address this more quickly, right? um, the mast cell piece is interesting, because that's actually, there's certainly testing that can be done for that. I find that the testing is a bit hit and miss, meaning the chances of false negatives on the test is very, very high. A lot of the tests have to be processed very specifically and have to be drawn and immediately put in a chilled centrifuge and spun and then kept on ice. And if it's not done, even minutes off of that protocol will, the half-life of some of these mediators is in the order of minutes. And so even minutes not in the right temperature can cause a degradation of that sample, and you might just have nothing there by the time it gets to the lab. So we'll frequently just try things, right, and treat the mast cell piece, because some of those treatments can overlap and be potentially beneficial for the tick-borne side too, right? So things like H1H2 blockade, Claritin and Pepsid, and then supplements like quercetin and magnesium, and there's a long list. There's many different things, even things like gastrochrome and ketotifen, especially if there's a lot of gastrointestinal or gut symptomology. So I find those are really helpful. And so, it's kind of like a symphony, right? You're kind of get all the instruments tuned up and learning the score and playing well together. And so a lot of times we'll be bouncing back and forth. We have to be careful in that realm to not overwhelm people. People, I think, a lot of people are very knowledgeable, but they're also sensitive. Their bodies are sensitive and they're reactive, and there's the sort of cognitive impairment piece that some people experience, and there's just logistics and cost and the burden of trying to take all these supplements and adhere to these lifestyle changes. So it can be really, really overwhelming, and that's a really big passion area of mine, of like, how do we make this better for the patient? How do we make this experience better and solve for the support that they need, and both from a care team and technology, to be successful on navigating these paths. Curious to hear, sort of on your end, how you see that and what your experience in your practice is with that complexity.
Yes, no, I agree. I mean, sometimes things come up to the surface, like I will find mold toxins in the vast majority of my patients. The article we just
Yeah.
published in Microorganisms 3 months ago was 84% were positive. But interesting, it's only been a handful of patients, at least lately, that the mold was really interfering strongly with the success of the Lyme-Bartonella protocols, the dapsone combination therapy. I have a patient in Europe and a patient in Florida. They had done 4 or 5 pulses of dapsone and they kept getting better, but they kept relapsing quickly and just weren't pushing ahead. And I said to them, have you ever had mold exposure? And they went, no, I don't think so. But they were both living near bodies of water. We tested them. The levels were off the wall. And both of these patients, once we started detoxing them, they got significantly better. So it was no longer the Lyme and the Bartonella and the Babesia, right? It was the mold that kind of moved to the top, as you were saying. Some things change over time. So it's a very good point. How do people get a hold of you? Do you have any upcoming events, anything you want to share with people that is important for the community?
Yeah, our website is we're the California Center for Functional Medicine, and the website is ccfmed.com. And if you go there, you can read a bunch of information. We're just trying to put a lot of helpful information onto the website, blog, newsletters, and also links out to our social channels are there. That would be, I think the best way for people to find us.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's dive back in. So, question: genetic or biomarker tests that you use to guide treatments? Do you look at the HLA factors? Do you do any of the specific, like there's some amazing genetic testing out there that I know some of the docs do, especially on psych medicines. How much do you use that genetic testing for these personalized treatments?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth with that, to be honest. We certainly, do think that the methylation testing, the MTHFR, COMT, these can be helpful. I feel like, we did a much deeper dive sort of using 23andMe to parse out a lot more of the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms. We've done that in the past. And I just felt like it wasn't really mapping out. I don't think the research was really holding up. The necessarily the ability for us to say, okay, here's this SNP, and this pathway could be deranged, and therefore you should take this supplement. I think that was an attractive link to make, but I feel like it broke down in practice, and I feel like there was a number of practitioners out there who were building very specific, very complex, very expensive protocols for people with tons of supplements based on their SNP reports, single nucleotide polymorphism reports. And I just wasn't convinced that that was sort of the way to be doing it. So we've backed off on that a bit. We still, again, really do believe in the methylation side. We'll frequently just support people with targeted B vitamins in there. The HLA, both for, I know Dr. Jones, I've worked with him, and he was using that for, Lyme predisposition potentially, and also, obviously, there's certain links to autoimmune rheumatic diseases, et cetera. Also that's been used, the HLA-DRB has been used in the mold field by Richie Shoemaker, that was popularized. And I feel also like that is not, that's not totally sold on that link. I think a lot of the folks in the mold field have moved away from some of those markers a little bit. Interestingly, I'm tracking some other markers as well. For example, markers of hypercoagulation, right? I think, the COVID pandemic really brought to light this whole microclot and hypercoagulation piece, which a lot of us knew was going on in the background with Lyme and chronic illness, chronic fatigue patients, but we didn't really have it mapped or tested as well. And so I'm excited for the opportunity potentially to have that become more available, whether it's thromboelastogram or other microclot testing. It's still not widely available yet for us, but I have been tracking things like factor V Leiden and also the Pi1 genetics, and so the Pi1 is, well supported in the literature for predisposing to embolic events, to clots, et cetera. And we really do see actually a lot of our chronic illness patients, showing positive Pi1 genetics. And so I do think there's a link there between this tendency or predisposition to forming clots or microclots, and then, the risk of these chronic illness pieces. So that's one thing that we're tracking.
You know, it's interesting you brought that up because you remember you've been around long enough as I have that years ago that was really discussed a lot whether you should even be using heparin in some of these patients when you'd see thrombin antithrombin products, right, and fibrinogen product. And the question was is like how much of a role was this playing? And of course, with COVID, with the microclots, right? In fact, there was an article that came out in Nature this morning on people who have myalgias, who have muscle pains with COVID, with this post-exertional fatigue, and they were finding mitochondrial dysfunction was playing a role, but they wanted to know if the clots were actually interfering with the oxygenation. They couldn't prove it in the recent study. We look for it from time to time. I've never been clear exactly what the role is. I believe over time that some of the supplements we're using, like N-acetylcysteine, we're giving to everyone with glutathione for the herxes, and it turns out that N-acetylcysteine blocks von Willebrand factor, so it stops clots. And I think the reason maybe we haven't seen as many clots in our patients because nobody's died from COVID in our practice. I think that it may be actually the NAC blocking some of those microclots forming. Do you have a protocol, by the way, that you're also using for COVID in your practice that you've integrated at this point?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, absolutely. And it continues to evolve, as we move through now into year 4 of this pandemic. But no, I agree. I think, some of the star players are things like N-acetylcysteine and glutathione, alpha lipoic acid, and a lot of the mast cell support. We find those really, really helpful. And so, yeah, no, I'm right there with you.
I mean, it's interesting that they've discovered, on the 16-point MSIDS map that I have, 8 out of 16 points have now been associated with long COVID. So, right, it's always like infections causing inflammation, causing immune dysfunction, right? And the immune dysfunction is causing POTS, and it's causing mitochondrial dysfunction and autoimmunity, and there's viral persistence and viral reactivation and low serotonin. They're finding the virus in the gut. I mean, it's very interesting to watch for those of us who've been doing chronic Lyme for so long, that the overlap is actually quite strong, right, at this point between both the symptoms and some of the pathophysiology. So let me just switch gears just for a second on these very sick patients I know who come to you like they do with me with comorbid conditions. Can you talk a little bit about how many people you're seeing at this point that have Babesia-Bart, that have some of these overlapping conditions, and where you published a wonderful article a couple of years ago that I think many in the Lyme community know. You did it with Hopkins researchers about some of the natural botanicals. And I was kind of wondering if you could talk for a minute how you use these botanicals in these people with these comorbid conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and preparing for this discussion today, I was rereading your MSIDS paper, one of the earlier ones. You've done so many. This was the 2018 that you published in Healthcare. The part 2 of the role of the MSIDS model. And so you provide some really excellent numbers and data in there. And I think we're seeing relatively similar, experience on our side. Although I will say, I think the front runners in terms of the tick-borne infections are really Lyme and Bartonella. And I'm actually debating these days, who's number one. Bartonella is really so prevalent. And while we know that Lyme is obviously passed via tick bite and maybe some other biting insects, it's not as well described as Bartonella, which is like, basically so many different biting insects that are biting multiple different animals or mammals and are transmitting, including fleas and lice, et cetera, as well as the cat scratch, route as well. So Bartonella, is really a big player on our side. And again, going back to the systemic infections, it crosses over so many different systems and also causes so much gut disruption. And so that is really, really one of the key pieces that we're seeing. And so, sorry, remind me the second part of the question.
So with the gut, so for example, you published some really great article with Hopkins researchers on the botanicals. And those botanicals do not affect the gut in the same way. You discuss cryptolepis and Chinese skullcap and Japanese knot. So maybe just share a little bit, because you do functional medicine, you're an expert in it. Maybe share a little bit how you use these botanicals, especially in people who have gut, problems or detox issues. I think it would be useful for everyone to hear.
Yes, absolutely. So it was really, really gratifying to be able to do that research with Dr. Zhang and Dr. Leone. We actually had 3 papers come out of that with Dr. Zhang's model. One was on Borrelia, one was on Babesia, and one was on Bartonella. And, some of the top botanical medicines that came out of that were fascinating, actually. I like to pause always when we talk about this in general public, because I think that there's a tendency to see that and to look at it and be like, okay, these botanical medicines can be used to treat Lyme or Babesia or Bartonella. And that's true. And that's part of how we selected these botanical medicines, because they're actually already being used in the community, the practitioner community, the patient community. But I do like to just, provide a framework and remind folks that these were test tube studies. These were in vitro studies. And so, basically we were taking the organisms and this is all done in Dr. Zhang's lab at Johns Hopkins at that time, growing the organisms and getting them to different life cycles, whether log phase growth or stationary phase biofilm, communities, and then adding the botanical medicines or the natural products to the test tube, right? And so it's very like kind of, reductionist science approach, which, to be honest, rubbed some herbalists the wrong way, because they and we and you recognize that some of these botanical medicines do have an antimicrobial effect, meaning they're going to kill the bug. But a lot of their action, they're basically built from, hundreds and hundreds of different active phytochemicals. And some of those have killing effects, and some of them have anti-inflammatory effects, or immune balancing effects, or hormone balancing effects, or gut healing effects. And so it's the synergy of an individual plant or botanical medicine, plus then adding multiple plants together. They have this sort of crosstalk and, community effect, really. And that's really where the magic of botanical medicines come, right? And so, I always like to point that out, not to say that we shouldn't and can't use these. We do, and we should use them. But we definitely still need more studies. We need more, animal studies and even human studies to really show what's going on. Now, backing up, so, what did we find in those studies? There were several key botanical medicines which showed, activity in this test tube model to kill all three of these organisms, right? And some of the key players, Cryptolepis was a super interesting find. I think that was sort of like the aha story of all this research, because you had talked about Cryptolepis. We've all known about Cryptolepis and its potential benefit for Babesia, given its historical use in Africa against malaria. And Babesia is a pyroplasm, malaria-like organism. And so the leap was made, let's use Cryptolepis against Babesia. And we did, in fact, see some clinical benefit with that, right? But to then find that in the test tube, this botanical medicine actually was able to kill and prevent regrowth, sort of this biofilm, stationary phase of the bacteria for Bartonella and Lyme was a big aha, right? That was really, really interesting to see. And so, yeah, Cryptolepis definitely has gotten more use in our clinic from that finding. And, other botanical medicines like Scutellaria, skullcap, which also has antiviral, antifungal, anti-inflammatory aspects. Scutellaria was one of the key herbs during COVID, and still.
And that's Chinese skullcap, right?
Yeah, I call skullcap, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then Japanese knotweed, Polygonum cuspidatum is the Latin name. So a lot of these key botanical medicines are really, well represented in our practice in terms of how we use them, when we use them. And a lot of times, going back to our earlier discussion, this is a really easy thing to reach for if you want to add something into a gut protocol or a hormone protocol or a detox protocol, mold protocol, heavy metal. It's very usually, lower side effect and lower risk to incorporate these sooner. And some people just have, a great response to them, and that's most of what they need. And some people will use that as sort of the entree and then transition to antibiotics when we're ready. And so a lot of times there's a sort of mix and match situation that happens.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. In fact, we used them. After I read your paper, I started using it for broader reasons, because I was using Cryptolepis primarily for Babesia before, right? And then also the articles came out on Duncani, where you can use, right, Acornia, Japanese knotweed, Chinese skullcap, Cryptolepis, right, Artemisinin. We started using all of these. I will still say, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, Babesia is highly, highly resistant. It is not an easy bug to be able to get rid of. And,
Yes.
The recent article about a week ago that got published on using tefenaquine and atovaquone, Mepron. And I asked my nurse practitioner, John Fallon, and I said, I've used a lot of it, fennequin, in the past, and I've a lot of combinations of ivermectin and a lot of herbs. And what I think is happening is we're knocking down the load of these bugs. And I think it's happening for a lot of these both herbal and antibiotic protocols. But it definitely requires, I think, a very comprehensive approach, and we need more research on it because I'm not convinced at this point that tafenoquine and atovaquone alone is going to be enough. And the side effects of tafenoquine is it can be a little severe with the anemia and the methemoglobin. So, yeah, there's a lot of research, and you're right. I mean, in human subjects, it's great to see it in the test tube. When I took the research from Hopkins on what happened in culture using sulfa drugs like dapsone or zithromax, rifampin, methylene blue phebart, what Hopkins didn't tell me, of course, is what were the doses of the drugs, how long to use them. I mean, this is where I had to figure out the clinical pieces, but it's still excellent work, and I think it works really well incorporating these herbs. I think you've done some great research there. It's a big addition to the scientific literature. So other questions I would have for you on is patient preferences. Like, you might have your ideas on, treating some of these people, and just like I do, we have to follow the patient's lead. They may have a sense that I don't want to do a lot of drugs this way. How do you work around that? How do you speak to patients about their preferences when you kind of work with these personalized models?
Yeah, and to me that dovetails with a bigger concept, which is that this work is very collaborative. It's not the classical sort of top-down, doctor says what to do, and then you just go and do it, and you're not really allowed to ask questions or question. We really try to check our ego at the door and try to understand that this is very complex, that everyone's very individual, and they need individualized care, and that they do come in with either psychological predispositions or physiological predispositions that where their body can or can't tolerate certain things, right? And that they're the expert. The patient is the expert here because they've been living with this condition frequently for long periods of time, and they've tried a lot of things usually, right? This is usually a very motivated, very smart population of people who have kind of been through the ringer, right? And they've read a bunch, they've listened to a lot of summits, and they've listened to a lot of podcasts, and they've seen a lot of practitioners, both mainstream and functional alternative. So that's one of my favorite things about my job is I get to learn every day from my patients, and at the same time, what patients don't have a lot of times is they don't have the pattern recognition that we have, and they don't have the experience treating hundreds or thousands of patients over decades. And so I will also kind of push people a little bit, and they say, oh yeah, I tried that and it can't do it, didn't work, don't want to do it. And I'll say, well, yeah, but when you tried it, you hadn't done all these other 7 things that we've now done, and so we're talking about a different terrain. And so I'm not going to tell you have to do anything, but let's maybe talk about what would feel safe and what would feel like a trial that you could get on board for. And we have definitely seen some breakthroughs that way too, right? So, we said very collaborative, but it is our job to continue to just kind of bring up all options and to present, a sort of a buffet of choices and also recommendations on sort of what we've seen as working in this individual case. And part of that is experience, part of that is science and research, and a lot of that's just intuition, right? It's just sort of our sense of what we've seen and what this looks like and what it smells like and what we have seen works in the past. And so it is, kind of feeling our way through it again a little bit.
Yeah, you brought up a great point about pattern recognition and this form of like personalized medicine and precision medicine, because I don't think of it in terms, I love the term about the pattern recognition because it's true, that's what it is. Ultimately, for example, BART, I agree with you. I mean, it's showing up now in the majority of our patients. And I've kind of wondered in the past how many of these resistant cases had BART, and we just didn't have the tools, right? We didn't have the direct droplet PCRs from Galaxy. We didn't have Bartonella immunoblots and BART fish. We didn't have T-Labs BART fit. I didn't have the tools, right, for 17 active Bartonella species to go tell someone that the pain in the bottom of your feet and these big lymph nodes you're having and your, severe eye problems and, horrible neuropathy you're having. I had no idea, right, that this could have been did to Bartonella vinsoni species or Elizabethae. But you're right, it's the pattern recognition That's severe neuropathy with BART, the last paper we just published, the ones who had the worst severe neuropsychiatric symptoms, right? Rosalie Greenberg and others have published on schizophrenia and BART. One of our patients reversed completely their psychosis, their hallucinations using dapsone and methylene blue. So, but you're right, the pattern recognition is really, in a sense, what helps with the personalized approach, because if someone has horrible neuropathy, horrible POTS dysautonomia, which showed up in our study, bad neuropsychiatric, pain in the bottom of the feet, the stretch marks, the classic striae or granulomas of BART, that's the pattern recognition that says, gee, maybe I should be putting BART to the top of my list, right? And going after that. So I think it's a great point. And I didn't think of it in those terms, but you're right. It's just like Babesia is the pattern recognition of day sweats, night sweats, chills, can't catch my breath, air hunger. We do differential diagnosis, what makes people short of breath, but ultimately it's the pattern recognition that helps with this kind of a personalized approach. So yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like, to your point on the Bartonella, I don't see mold or MCAS causing some of those symptoms, like pain in the bottoms of feet or the striae, or, it can do some of the neuropsych, but, there's some specific symptoms that really kind of bring our attention to that part of the case. And that's why, again, amazing debt of gratitude to you for publishing on the HMQ, the Horowitz Medical Questionnaire, and giving us now a statistically standardized survey instrument, which we can use to sort of stratify, probably not, possibly, probably. And that's been really, really valuable. And I think that, the next step in my brain of what really needs to happen from a precision medicine, from a personalized medicine point of view, to really help solve for Lyme disease and also just all chronic illness, all complex chronic illness, is to really get better at using data and to use data in a way that's intelligent and is proactive, and using this, this new, really almost tidal wave of AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And, you've done, very amazing and robust, data pulls from your charts, but it's also very manual. And so how do we scale that? How do we get, a system out where we have a data dashboard now, which is pulling things in automatically, and almost, like my friend and mentor Daniel Kraft, he talks about, this idea around wearables and sensors. And our cars are so smart and they're very electronically heavy now, and they have hundreds if not thousands of sensors, and all what's happening in the background, and then a little check engine or little service now light will come on. So we need that for humans, right? We need some system that's tracking our wearable data and our symptom data and our treatment data and treatment outcomes, and either saying, okay, everything looks like it's going decently well, or oh, something's not going well. You should go in and get that checked out by an expert. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's a lot of potential in the next decade of where we're all going. And I think AI is going to play a really big role with that. So I'm actually pretty excited about where we're at.
No, you're right. Obviously the big data is important, and when I had to go through the charts in my office, this was done by hand. I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't have the tools, and in fact, I'm just going to EHR for the first time after 40 years, because we're moving, I believe, into our medical barn shortly, where I can't have these thousands of charts following with me. But you're right. I mean, the AI revolution is going to help. And by the way, I mean, you may have heard about this, but I probably by the end of this year, I hope, I'm just starting to work on a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled randomized trial for dapsone. And we will be developing the protocols there, looking at the big data as best we can. I spoke to Bob Mosiani about it, about using Bayesian statistics. So you can actually look at the data as it's coming in and possibly adjusting it versus completely blinded. We have to figure it out. But I think that's going to answer a lot of questions, because I'm hoping to get like 150 people, 50 in one arm that does exactly the protocol we just published in Microorganisms, one that has a placebo that's dapsone that nobody knows who got placebo or not, and then another arm that's maybe a Plaquenil doxycycline just for a standardized control group to compare. But we're going to look at the 16-point MSIDS model and see how many people have mold and how many people have metals and how many people have gut disruption, because without gathering that data in large numbers of people, it's very, very difficult to figure out, as you said, with this chronically ill population we have. And I think most people know at this point, half of America, 50% of Americans suffer from one chronic disease. And 87% of our healthcare costs, 70% of the deaths are due to chronic disease. And we don't have a model to be dealing with this. And that's where I think the integrative functional medicine approach, internal medicine is great. It's great for acute care. It's great for blood pressure and cholesterol and whatever. But when you're dealing with these chronic illnesses, you definitely need a new viewpoint, a new lens. And I think you're right. The AI approach will definitely help us here. So
yeah, no, I'm super excited that you're doing that next round of research. Because the other thing that needs to happen also with this data is like, because we need support, we need guidance. And it's very hard, it's very manual and very labor intensive to do this work, and it's hard to scale. And so there's just so many people out there who need help globally, and having that data coming back in hopefully in real time to the practitioner can be super valuable, but it also can be extremely valuable for, again, doing exactly the kind of research you're doing and proving out this treatment works, this one doesn't work, this works for this type of person, for this genetic subtype, or with these other comorbid conditions, et cetera. So no, I can't wait for. I know it's going to be a little bit of a time window for you to get that all done. Are you tracking any kind of wearable data or symptom data with the research you're doing now?
There will be some, because obviously I have to track POTS dysautonomia with heart rate and blood pressure, right, for these patients, because just like with long COVID, in the last study we published, I think it was 40%, and that's what was roughly in the healthcare one I published in 2018. You cited, I think it was like a third of the patients. But yeah, I mean, we have to have some wearable data, absolutely. And it's a good point. By the way, I will be passing around that study to people like you, Bay Area, Lyme, it's a wonderful organization. You've been with them for years, and I'm on their board also, the advisory board. They've done some amazing work. And I will be running this study by everybody, by your smartest people at Bay Area Lyme, and by you before this goes out. I told Brian Fallon and John Alcott, same thing. I want everyone to review it. So, because we have one shot at this, we've not had a randomized trial in 16 years, roughly, and the time has come. So, I'm just one or two, just one or two last questions for you with this. How often do you have to revisit these treatment plans? Because, like in my office, I will generally find that obviously, if all is going well, I don't have to bother looking at this. But I do notice sometimes, people are doing well, they're getting better and better, and all of a sudden they hit a roadblock. And I'm kind of curious, how often do you see this happen? And do you have to go back? Because sometimes I have to go back and go, gee, we haven't checked the adrenals in 2 years. I wonder whether the adrenals are lower. One time we had the thyroids normal 6 months before, and then all of a sudden they were hypothyroid. How often do you have to revisit your plans in these personalized precision models?
Yeah, my experience in our practice is that it's actually, we're iterating a lot, and we're kind of constantly evaluating symptoms. We have people fill out multiple symptom questionnaires for every visit. Things like the MSQ and the NAH Promise 10 and the fatigue severity scale. And so we're kind of just tracking that in, not real time, but, semi-real time per each visit. And so basically, to your point, like, yeah, looking for those fluctuations and looking for those sort of branch points where, because I think what happens is that, and Wayne Anderson taught me this a long time ago, is that the immune system can really only focus effectively on one, maybe two things at a time. And so the symptom picture will be reflective of what the immune system is trying to deal with, whether it's Lyme or Babesia or viruses, et cetera. And then we provide testing, and then we provide treatments, and we're working on potentially, hopefully, that problem that the body needs to resolve most high level. And then we do that, and we've effectively either treated it or gotten it into the background, and now the immune system will shift its focus and reprioritize. And so you might see a very different symptom picture appear, and that can be very disconcerting for people, and actually very distressing, right? Because they said, wow, I was getting so much better, and now all of a sudden I feel like the wheels are coming off the bus again, and like this, I've never had this thing happen before. What's going on? Is this not working? Should I go see somebody else? And so I think with that, like, reassurance and hand-holding, we can really explain to people, actually, no, this is normal. This is what we do see happen. We think that this means that your body's shifting its focus now, and it's much more of a Bartonella picture, whereas maybe before it was Lyme. And so, because again, just because the tests are negative doesn't mean those bugs aren't there, right? I always tell people, usually on the test, a yes is a yes and a no is a maybe, right? And we do have, you listed off some of these better, direct
By the way,
detection
can I
sites.
use that with my wife that a yes is a yes, but a no is a maybe? Can I'm looking at.
Absolutely. Say hi to Lee for me as well, too. Um, yeah. So, yeah, you know, we don't that's another holy grail, which again, Barrier Lyme has been trying to track is improving diagnostics, because the state of the tests that we can run are fairly abysmal. It's definitely improving. It's gotten better over the last decade. But there's so much richness in science, and with transcriptomics and proteomics and metabolomics and all this sort of phenomic health.
Yeah.
I think that there's optimism, but it really is dependent on the symptoms. That's where the whole story frequently is.
No, I agree. And where it gets tricky, and I think you're probably seeing the same thing as me, is that people will go along well, I've treated their Lyme and their BART and the Babesia quiescent, and all of a sudden they start to develop. I just got an email this morning from someone. The night sweats started coming out, right, with the air hunger. It's like the Babesia all of a sudden reactivated. And he had done very
Yeah.
well before with some atovaquone and azithromycin. And he asked me, should I go back on it? And the answer was, yeah, you need another treatment course of it. And what happens is sometimes a normal adrenal from 2 years ago can now be stage 3 adrenal dysfunction. And the reason you're so tired and not responding is, you need some adrenal support, whether it's hydrocortisone or herbs, glandulars, whatever, or your POTS wasn't so bad, all of a sudden it's worse, or you got COVID and now you're reactivating Epstein-Barr virus or herpes virus 6. So, in these precision personalized models, and I think all of us who do this have to kind of keep going back and saying, and you said it really great before with the pattern recognition, if a certain symptom is coming out, if it's fatigue, it's tough because it's everything from hormones to viruses to Lyme, Babesia, BART to, the gut. It's difficult.
Yeah,
But if there's
exactly.
specific patterns, you go after it. And oftentimes we see that sometimes tests that were even normal or borderline before change over time. So I think you do have to keep going back and reevaluating. And you're right, that pattern recognition and having kind of the tools where you go through, for example, for me, the 16 points. Did I do mitochondrial regeneration? Have I checked your blood pressure lately? How's your neuropsych doing? Is there trauma? And I mean, this, you see this, you discussed it earlier. The trauma and the emotional trauma in some of these people, it affects their immune system, where it's almost like they're programmed that, I don't want to get better. And you've got to go in there and use techniques like anti-hopper DNRS or Gupta. I think all of these tools that we have are very, very important. And, I think in kind of finishing this up a little bit, this personalized medicine approach, I agree with you. It's I think the best way to go, because it's kind of the sanest way of addressing it, because everyone is completely different. I don't think any of us, treat patients the same. We have certain tools we use, but it's different. So, thank you for bringing that up. I think the pattern recognition point and kind of reevaluating it's a very important point when you're trying to get these chronically ill patients better.
Yeah, no, beautiful. And also, anytime you have a speed bump or a change in the clinical picture, or you have a decompensation or you have a regression, that's also always an important opportunity to just cross-check and double down on all of the lifestyle pieces, right? What's going on with sleep? What's going on with mindfulness and meditation and breath work? And, what's going on with movement, and what's going on, to your point, the neuroplasticity, the brain retraining piece, we see that as huge, 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 right? And so really agree with that. The amygdala gets into a fight, flight, freeze. And I do think that a lot of folks with complex chronic illnesses were primed from early on. They frequently have a high ACE score, adverse childhood event. And that has, the research is incredibly robust on that, causing immune dysfunction and cortisol dysregulation and, downstream risk of chronic illness. And so really, really have to double down on all those pieces. The diet, were they gluten-free or on more of a, anti-inflammatory diet, but then went, traveling or just stopped doing it, or kind of regressed, or drinking more alcohol or not sleeping. All these pieces are really critical. They're kind of a bummer sometimes. It takes a lot of work, and it can be socially isolating, but there's also a lot of power there for people because they can take charge of their health. And I want to point out one nuance before we pause also, that I've been learning about a lot recently with regards to breath work. So breathing, right? And so James Nestor's book called Breathe is amazing. There's a lot more awareness now about the importance of breath work and breathing. but it's not so much just about, pace your breathing, count certain numbers, breathe in, breathe out. There's actually a lot of very deep science around um, carbon dioxide and oxygen balance, and what's your CO2 tolerance, and trying to achieve a higher level of CO2 in the body so that you get better oxygen delivery to the tissues and to the brain. And so working sometimes with a trained breathwork coach or a myofunctional therapist, and even using devices like a capnometer. There's consumer-based, capnography devices which can measure the end tidal CO2 during your breathing. And then some people are kind of surprised, like, oh, I thought I was, breathing well or breathing correctly, but in fact, I had some work to do. And there's another device, I just have it on my desk here, actually. This is called the Breather Fit, and this is like basically like a workout machine for your diaphragm. And so basically it has two dials, one on each side. And so one will create more resistance on the in-breath, and the other one will create more resistance on the out-breath. And so you can actually train your diaphragm. You can basically exercise your diaphragm. So people can look that up online. It's a globally available device. They're based in Europe. And so that piece, and really, again, the mental, cognitive piece is not to be underestimated. We find it really, really important.
No, thanks. It's important. And I'm assuming probably with this breath work and training the diaphragm, you're seeing it help with some of the vagus nerve dysfunction, because obviously the vagus nerve is controlling immunity. It's controlling POTS. Are you seeing it help with some of these people?
Absolutely, yeah. It's controlling immunity, it's controlling POTS, it's controlling gut, it's controlling, airway, all these, everything, basically everything, most organs all the way up to the transverse colon, right? So super, super important cranial nerve that is a vital importance.
Well, Sinja, we're coming out of time here. I want to thank you so much for taking the time today to do this. It was great seeing you. We need to connect a little bit more. Can you please tell people again just the best way to contact you if they want more information from your practice?
Running this summit. Our practice is called the California Center for Functional Medicine, and it's www.ccfmed.com. You can find a bunch of information there, and also links to all of our social accounts there, where we're fairly active.
Great. Well, thank you again. It was a great talk. It was great seeing you. Please give my best to your wife and to the family, and to all the people at Bay Area Lyme for all the great work they're doing. And for those of you who are following on the Doctors Talk Summits, we'll be seeing you again soon for the next episode. So thank you for coming on board and attending this particular important talk. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Take care.